Good evening, everyone. I'm Demian, and we'll be talking about sacred trash today. So basically, the leading question of this presentation is, what happens to sacred objects when they're no longer wanted, they become old or damaged, or where do they go after years of worship and whatnot? In this case, for me, this was a religious studies paper in this case that took a comparative studies approach towards different religions. In this case, there are many different ways of approaching the study of trash, but in this case, I decided to focus more on three categories, basically texts, two-dimensional images or paintings, and finally, three-dimensional images or statuaries in this case. Mainly because each of them reflect different aspects of the form of disposal in their own context. So for me, I use the theoretical analysis with Darian Douglas, who's an early example who makes binary between purity and impurity, although this is not always accurate for the objects because they are sacred, or they were sacred at one point, that fall in between these spaces. Then we have Irene Stings, who defines sacred trash as material residues, surpluses that neither cannot be disposed of as just garbage because they're sacred, but neither can be kept or left alone. And then my main author here was Arjun Appadurai, who talks about objects having social lives, this idea of these materials having lives of their own. And thus, it's a helpful analysis for tracking out where these objects are going in their afterlives. And finally, we have Louis Jendik's analysis where garbage acts as a tallale. In other words, disposal reveals what people's attitudes and relationships are with these different kinds of objects. And it could apply in different ways, but we're going to focus on the religious studies phase. So, famously with disposal, we have this idea of iconoclasm. Most people think of iconoclasm as this direct destruction and annihilation of images, although that's not always the case. Usually most people look at Deuteronomy that calls for people to break down altars, smash stones, etc., in most of the Western Hemisphere. But Buddhist scholars Fabian Belli and Aaron Reinders propose a fourfold catalog of destruction, four kinds of iconoclasm around this idea. Basically, first off, attacks that keep the objects intact, but their status and mode of display to achieve a demotion, redefinition, or humiliation. There's a second, harmful preservative destruction, both by iconoclasts and preservers alike. Third, piety-driven iconoclasm, or what some might call benevolent iconoclasm, the proper disposal of sacred objects. And finally, semiclasm and helioclasm, destruction of meaning, or the destruction of sacred meaning in this case. So we'll begin with text in this case with benevolent disposal and interment that reflects these emptings. So in Tibetan Buddhism, you have texts and mantric texts, which are ritual forms of power in this case. These inscriptions are very sacred. Like, for example, here you see one of them that says that promises enlightenment just by seeing it, as everyone here is auspicious to see today. There are others that promise rebirth from the lower realms, etc., etc. In this case, these mantras and their inscriptions are very powerful. Likewise, they also serve as the organs for sacred statues, or they vitalize images. So these are very important things. But, like all things, eventually these objects must decay or degrade, so they must be replaced. Traditionally, you would cremate these objects and have visualizations where you're absorbing their energies in this case. But in the today in the contemporary environmentalism, there's concerns about burning causing pollution and whatnot. So some people have advocated recycling them. But some lamas have not liked this. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, a major figure in America, has actually expressed concern about recycling sacred texts risks them becoming toilet paper, which was something he did not want these texts to become. So in this case, you have this idea like, are you going to cremate them and thus risk the environment? Or another method, which was to dispose of them at the right side of the pilgrimage road, which causes an accumulation of all these texts here and there. Now, you could pick them up in this case, but then they're just left around in the environment, so there's this issue over excess in this case, especially plastics. Although these objects are sacred, they are made out of plastics, and we have too much of them. There are concerns about excess in this case. In the Jewish context, we have an interesting case where texts are disposed. There's a certain mannerism to disposing texts. The Tibetan Buddhists have their own thing, but in Judaism, it has its own phenomena. So there's a quote in Exodus that calls for people not to wrongly use the name of God in this case. Also, there are consequences of this. In Shalom Oslander, an Orthodox Jew who grew up in Brooklyn in this case, he talked about how his name, Shalom, which means peace, is actually one of the names of God. Unfortunately, every time he wrote his name anywhere, his homework, his text exams, his baseball cards, his underwear at one point, all had to be disposed in this thing called a Shimus box, the green thing you see there. Basically, because they contain his name, Shalom, they all had to be disposed properly. So yes, all of a sudden, his text exams were sacred and whatnot. So anyway, to deal with this, in the American context, because there is a lack of space, as opposed to Jews in Denmark, you have to have these Shimos boxes to collect all these things, or Shemot. So a name like Shalom is one of the names of God, or a Shemot, so it falls under the first category of sacred objects in this case. So you would see this case where they have to be interned in genizas or buried properly in this case. Anyway, so there's a geniza and a Shimos box. At one point, when texts enter the geniza, they all become homogeneously equal in this case, where they all become one and the same. They become old papers until an archaeologist discovers one. But these are the forms of benevolent iconoclasm. Then we make on to the second category of second dimensional images, the love or fear of images. So in the Korean shamanic tradition, the Mugyo in this case, it is believed that the Shin or the gods reside in paintings, and they get to decide where they go. So if a curator wants to have this image, they have to do divination to see if the god consents to be taken or not. If they don't, well, then the god, they can't take them. Otherwise, you would have to cremate these paintings. However, in Korea, due to the stigma, because the majority is Christian, Protestant Christian, and there is a stigma against shamanism, there are many cases where people are afraid of having these images in the first place. And even family members of Manshin are afraid of inheriting them. Else there are many responsibilities, they cause chaos in life, etc. Yet for the Manshin who own these, there is reluctance to dispose them for they adore it, as opposed to the fear that people have of these images like these you see here. In Ghana, though, there is an interesting parallel where we have the evil heart of Jesus. So in Ghana, there are different kinds of Christians. So there are the Catholics who revere the Sacred Heart of Jesus, it's a holy image. There are some Ghana Protestant groups that also use the Heart of Jesus, this one here, as a way of demarcating where you pray. However, some Ghanese Pentecostals have accused these images of stalking them. They believe that there are demons possessing these images that are stalking them wherever they go and following them, to the point that they have had to completely destroy these images. There is also the verse about idolatry that's connected to this here, but also people are feeling that the Jesus image is actually stalking them, which is an interesting case in parallel with the Korean shamanic circles. And finally, we go to our third category of statuaries, death or imprisonment. So in this case, we're going to focus on the death part, where with harmful iconoclasm, your classic torturing and humiliating of images. And in this case, for example, in the 16th century French Protestants, you see Protestants, although they deny that the image has a meaning in the first place or that it's even alive, interestingly enough, they torture the image as if it is a human criminal themselves. Whether or not they recognize it or not, it definitely has a devastating effect on Catholics who adore these images. So it is shocking to see the Virgin Mary being whipped in the streets or throwing down paintings in toilets, etc., etc. Now, in the late antique world of early Christianity, you see cases where sometimes you didn't need to destroy the whole image. Rather, you just need to chop off, delimb, denose, gouge out, or whatever the image is in this case, so that they would be empowered. In some cases, that was not enough, so he had to inscribe huge crosses to exorcise the images. In this case, like the Protestant context, the goal is to humiliate the image in this case. You see this in the medieval Islamic world too, where although you get accounts of people destroying images, they also recontextualize the images to serve other places, such as, for example, being part of the floor tiles in a mosque where people can step over it. Interesting enough, though, this also protects the mosque from pigeons, scorpions, snakes, all kinds of harmful things. So it's not all. So there's another usage for it. And then you have, but then in cases like the Taliban, like the Bamiyan Buddhas, the Bamiyan Buddhas were really iconoclast in the Middle Ages. But because people had attention to it, like museums want to save this, the Taliban did not like this idea where the museums were concerned about the statues rather than the Afghanis. So there was a call to completely destroy these images because people were still latching meaning onto them. Which then brings me to my final point on the museum as the afterlife or a prison. So in this case, a museum is an interesting repository of all these things in this case. Before you had benevolent iconoclasm or forms of destruction, but now you have the museum just taking on these damaged images. And this is where semiotic iconoclastic takes, where the images change meanings. Occasionally, you might have devotees and museum pilgrims doing active engagement and worship, like putting dollar bills in this Ganesh statue in New York City. But sometimes even if a museum tries to elaborately display these things, like in their original context, it's not always successful. Like there is one point, the issue of have the images been deconsecrated or not? And also, in an ironic case with the Rubin Art Museum in New York City, there was a case where the Tibetan community did not know that there was a museum dedicated to Tibetan Buddhism. And there was lots of controversy about how these images were obtained, to the point that there were even protests about the images. They are being tortured, they are being imprisoned, they have lives, they must be treated accordingly. Yet, they are not so with the museums, who profit from people looking at these things. Admittedly, there is an educational aspect to museums, and sometimes it can be beneficial, like the Sacred Arts of Haitian Vodou, where the museum got actual Haitian practitioners to set up these cases, where instead of being individualized in certain spaces in the middle of its form, it would instead be depicted together as the assemblage. Although this was not always successful, like with the Tropen Museum in the Netherlands, where the museum only focused on the Bizango secret society forms of Vodou, which terrified a lot of people who saw them. So there is a leeway to being careful of how you depict these sacred images. In the Tropen Museum, where people were fearful of the images, they were also felt that the images were alive in a sense. So it's an interesting case of, are the images being deprived or not? Who is profiting on them? Is the community connected to these images in this case? Anyway, those are the different afterlives of the objects. Any questions?
So you cover a huge breadth of religions
Yes.
and of time periods. 2 questions.
Yes.
How long is this paper? And are you interested in expanding on any of the specific examples in the future?
First, over 50 pages, actually. Technically, it was supposed to be 50, but I kind of went overboard with my thesis. Anyway, so it went over 50 pages comparing different traditions. And the second one, I do intend on expanding on this materiality studies. Like, this was influenced by some of my associations with different religious communities in Boston, the Haitian Vodou community, Cuban Santeria groups, etc. And there was always this issue of, where do we put these objects? And that kind of influenced my interest in religious materiality, in this case, like the social lives that people add to these things. Anyway, any other questions?
Demian, congratulations on this
Thank you.
project. This is maybe a silly curiosity.
Yes.
You focused on sacred objects that become waste. Did you come across anything in your research that maybe began as unsacred waste and became a sacred object?
There are actually cases. I did not have time to cover those cases, but yes, there are cases where, well, it depends how you define it. Like where a long lost image becomes re-deified again and restructured, or other times a deity demands that this waste becomes sacred. Like, it's an interesting case. That's its own complexity in this case, but they do definitely exist for sure in Cuban circles and whatnot. Yes.
Hi. Great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm interested if you're aware if there are any arguments, particularly from the side of the religious practitioners, of inclusion of items like that in museums, despite them being potentially like desecrated in doing so, at the benefit of educating people who are unaware.
Oh, yes. That's the thing. Like, the Rubin Museum, it intended on being an educational space for Tibetans. However, the Tibetan community of New York City in Queens did not know about this museum. And when they found out, and also about how the museum acquired these objects in the first place, there's lots of tensions in this case. Like, it's, in a way, it is self-serving the museum to display them. It benefits the museum. They continue being a repository. But at the same time, without a community in this case, the objects kind of fall in the leeway. They become fetishized. They just become objects for people to look like. Without the community, it kind of lacks the life force in a way. There's lots of controversies around this topic, definitely for sure. But from what I've noticed, there's definitely an importance of including the community attached to these things. Otherwise, the objects sort of lose their stories in ways.
All right. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Demian.